So the Super Bowl is about to pass, and for the Browns' purposes, it might as well be the new league year. So it's time for us to start talking about the next crop of Browns that are going to come in, the rookies of next year, and the next crop of fresh faces. And to do that, I'm bringing in Corey KINNAN. He's a managing editor at Browns Wire, also the co-host of the Daft on Draft podcast, where he talks about the draft. He also talks about the Browns. He's also famous Twitter face of Browns Twitter. Corey, how's everything going with you, man?
It's good, Quincy. I don't know if you'd say famous. This face people tend to copy and paste it as like a retort to an argument that I have. So I might say infamous face, but I'm doing good, man. I'm happy to be on the show. I've been a big fan of the show for a while, so happy to be on.
Appreciate you. Look, we all have the same arguments with the same people. It's just different accounts, all the time. But, when we talk about the Browns this year, I think it's an interesting conversation because in the offseason, we focus on where the holes are for a good reason because you want to fix wherever you have a hole at. But you also have to have the understanding of like your team's just going to have some holes. Like you're not going to have the perfect roster, right? You're not going to be able to plug every hole in there. When you look at this Browns roster, if you had to categorize which holes are probably in the most high priority situation and which holes are at the, I understand we could use this, but we could get by with it. Like, if you look at this roster, what position groups do you say threat level midnight versus not?
Yeah, I mean, the defensive line is obviously the big threat level midnight that everybody likes to talk about. I mean, there wasn't a worse defensive tackle room in the NFL. And that's not an exaggeration. Like Tommy Togiai doesn't make the roster next year. Jordan Elliott's going to be fighting for a roster spot next year. Taven Bryan might not. I'd be open to Taven Bryan coming back as like a third down rotational defensive tackle, but not as a starter, not as a gap shooting starter on first and second down. But Perrion Winfrey very honestly could be the only defensive tackle back in that room next year. So you have to start there. But edge isn't much better outside of Myles Garrett. Again, I personally would like to see what this group would look like if they switch up some positional coachings. And again, they haven't done that yet. They haven't fired any defensive positional coaches. So what would Alex Wright look like without Chris Kiffin? How would Isaiah Thomas continue to step up without Chris Kiffin? I think those are arguments that are valid. But again, Chase Winovich, he's going to be gone. Most likely. They could re-sign him for a small deal. Who knows? Jadeveon Clowney's gone. So, I mean, they signed Stephen Weatherly, who, I had high hopes for. Like, he was pretty productive in Denver before he came to Cleveland. Blew out his knee in camp and didn't play at all. So, it definitely starts with the defensive line. But what I'm most interested in is how do the Browns weigh their need versus... I think positional value is a little bit overblown in terms of draft value. But going back to that Grossi article that got everybody up in arms that came out about a pretty basic concept of analytics that explosive plays win games. The Browns offense is one of the least explosive passing games in the league. So I tend to think they're probably going to value that really high compared to the defensive line.
Mm-hmm. So you think it's going to be about the explosives?
I mean, they can't ignore the defensive line, but I think if we're talking draft versus free agency, just looking at the trend of how defensive tackles tend to play early in their careers, it doesn't tend to be well. I mean, outside of the first rounders, you don't tend to get solid production out of defensive tackles. So I think that's going to be an avenue where they say we really need to hit this in free agency versus the draft. I think you could go out and get an explosive playmaker in the draft.
Yeah, and even then at the first round, like Jordan Davis, probably one of the most ready prospects we've seen, and like even then he wasn't like great like you would expect in his first year. If I can go back, I think the most most recent one I can point out, maybe Big Jeff, was he good early out there in Tennessee? I felt like it took him a couple of years.
Well, he blew his knee out the pre-draft process, so it took him a little while to see the field, but he was pretty good almost immediately once he took the field.
Yeah, so they're guys,
which his tape was never the issue for Jeffrey Simmons. It was always the other stuff. But
look, there's two guys whose tape I watch. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I see why. I see Jeffrey Simmons, and then there was that Aaron Donald tape that came out. I was like, oh my god, I remember like that's the best player in the 2014 draft, but he plays defensive tackle, and you're fighting all those perceptions, and all I saw was him eat two dudes from Duke up in 1 second. It was one of the most amazing things you had ever seen. If you've not watched it, Go open a new tab, and when you have the time, watch Aaron Donald's college highlights. It is unreal that like he went 14th in that draft after doing what he did at Pitt. But there's not going to be an Aaron Donald in the second round for the Browns. There's not going to be an Aaron Donald in the third round for this team. And even more interesting, we talk about having to fill these needs at defensive tackle in free agency. That's a hard position to fill in free agency, right? Because a lot of these things kind of transition and change, and you're going through a transition, but it doesn't seem like you're fully through that transition. Like, I don't know if maybe they're thinking they're going to switch out position coaches after the draft, or they're just going to rock with the same guys underneath. That's a little concerning because it feels like, why did you switch out coordinators if you're going to keep the same? I don't know what's going on there with that, but who are the guys in free agency that you think, hey, the Browns can reasonably get and get? Are they going to be the big names everybody's talking? Deron Payne, maybe even like try to snag a DeForest Buckner off of a team like the Colts, or is this going to be guys that you might know of if you're really into this thing, like a Dalvin Tomlinson or something like that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. One that kind of goes to what does Jim Schwartz think he has on the roster? Again, what he likes to employ opposite of his wide nine, which we assume Myles Garrett is playing wide nine. I also think Myles Garrett has the body type where if you need to play him at big end and go draft a thinner, bendier edge rusher to play wide nine, I think you could stick Myles Garrett at big end on early downs. I think that's not out of the realm of possibility. But do you think? I mean, Alex Wright's huge. Do you think Alex Wright can do that in year two? He didn't instill a lot of faith in year one, but again, he was kind of thrown into the fire straight out of UAB when Jadeveon Clowney got hurt week 2. So he was starting week 3 after coming from a G5 program straight to the NFL. So I guess it kind of depends what Jim Schwartz thinks he can get out of the roster. But as sexy as like a Deron Payne would be, or a Javon Hargrave would be, man, I don't know, man, if they're going to be willing to invest that much when you need that much depth along the defensive line. I go back to the Moneyball, the Brad Pitt Moneyball movie where they lose Jason Giambi, and they're like, we got to replace Giambi, and he goes, we're going to do it in the aggregate, and he throws 3 names on the board instead of 1. So that's kind of how I kind of envision this going for them as well. And I think it's a good free agent class for defensive tackles. I'm a big fan of there's 2 dudes out in LA on the Rams that are both free agents, Ashawn Robinson and Greg Gaines. Greg Gaines is good, man. I like Greg Gaines a lot. Draymond Jones out of the Broncos, Ohio State product. If you've seen the tweets he's been liking, I don't think he's going back to Denver. And I don't think they're going to get any trade value out of a tag and trade, considering the defensive tackle tag is $19 million. So that could be a target. But again, the Deron Paynes are out there. I think DeForest Buckner has a very tradable contract. I wouldn't be opposed to a splash play, but the amount of money they need to invest in that offensive or that defensive line, and the amount of bodies they need to invest in that defensive line is like it needs overhauled. And if you spend big money on one, you might be skimping out elsewhere.
Yeah, you mentioned something interesting I want to kind of touch on, right? Because there's 3 names here that I think are interesting. The production and the tape might not have been like consistent or great, but I do think there's something to squeeze out of them. You mentioned Taven Bryan, but on top of it, I think what Alex Wright is somebody who's interesting because I don't know where his fit is on this defense, but I think there's a place for him. I think it might be closer to center, well, not like at center, obviously, but he might be closer to the center of the line of scrimmage than he is a edge player traditionally, because I think there were just some things, if you look at that game against Buffalo, it just kind of shot out to me. Like when he's in space, he has some issues sometimes moving and bending. But, you know, maybe he exists closer to more of a power end if you want to do something like that, and then just change your strategy of what you would draft around. I think Jordan Elliott is interesting because there's flashes of stuff there with him. It's just never consistent, but it's been like 3 or 4 years of flashes at this point. And then obviously there's Perion Winfrey, who's probably the most promising out of all of them. Maybe you get more out of him if you just ask him to do some specific things instead of asking him to do everything. And it's funny because I was talking about this with somebody else, and it's like, that was literally the problem at Oklahoma, right? Is that he was being asked to do everything there, and he was good at like maybe these things. And if you make him do these things, and they did that at the Senior Bowl, okay, he looks pretty good. But then he gets to the NFL, and he's suddenly in this situation again to where they're asking him to do a lot more. I wonder, is that like a thing with like coaches just see him come in, they see how athletic and like long and, you know, he has all this stuff, and then they go, ah, man, he's got to be able to do everything. And instead of just kind of going in this mindset of, this is what Perrion can do. You know, I think the same thing happened a lot with Larry Ogunjobi in his career, where we wanted him to do everything. And it was very evident, clear early on. Larry Ogunjobi, really good for 2 downs. You know what I mean? But not necessarily a 3-down player. Well, why do you think it takes so long for, you know, coaches to kind of just trust that that's what that player is going to be doing?
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak for league wide, but I think it was pretty evident with Joe Woods. He was pretty stuck in his scheme. We saw it for 3 years of really poor defensive tackle plays. Even with like Malik McDowell is an absurd specimen of a human being, like playing defensive tackle, and he couldn't get anything out of him. Malik Jackson was supposed to be that veteran anchor who would come in, be a leader, and just know how to do his job. And he was putrid as well. So like, I can't speak for around the league, and I don't know if it's doing too much, or they're not asked to 2-gap. They're not really asked to anchor the run that much. They're just kind of asked to penetrate. And I don't think that's a recipe for success. And again, Winfrey's built like an ox, man. Like he's got massive, massive arms, and his lower half is explosive as they come. Like he's an explosive dude. So I mean, if he can get somebody who can teach him how to fire out with a low pad level, because I think that's a big issue for him, is his pad level is just way too high right now, and he's compromising all of his leverage points that those long arms can give him. Then yeah, I don't think he's going to have any issue lining up at 3-tech, anchoring and doubles. But again, that goes back to like, I don't know how this positional coach is coaching these dudes either. I don't know how the defensive coordinator is coaching these dudes. So I'd like to see a fresh start outside of just Jim Schwartz. I'd like to see a fresh start with those defensive line coaches as well. So I don't know. I don't know if that answered your question. I can't really speak for league wide, but I just don't feel like the defensive tackles were asked to do anything other than just try to penetrate and shoot gaps, and that was not productive.
Yeah, they were just going all the way up and opening doors. You know, it was bad at some points of it. You know, and I remember in Jim Schwartz's press conference, he talked a lot about like being able to coach coaches. So I don't know if that means this philosophy is like, you know, maybe it was just incompetence or something at top, and maybe these guys are good coaches. I don't know. We'll figure this out as time goes on eventually with this whole coordinator switch here. Let's talk about some of the guys in this upcoming draft here. You mentioned wide receiver if you're talking about the Browns draft needs, especially since the price of receiver has, like, we talk about inflation. That inflation is I looked up, and when Tyreek Hill got like 35 million in a year. That is like, we used to look at them Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry contracts like, oh man, it's not sustainable. You know, these guys are at 14 and 20 million a piece. Yeah, and now you look at that, it's like that's what you would sign Tyler Boyd to. You know what I mean? Like, it is right. The market. Like I think one of the things I'm going to keep in mind, I was talking to this with Dave Bacon on Cleveland.com, was like, I just don't think the Browns have the amount of expendable cap space to buy a free agent wide receiver at this point, right? To be able to spend, I think they got to get somebody on a contract already, or they got to draft somebody, because the prices are insane at this point for these guys. So when you look at the draft and you look at some of these wide receivers, well, who are the guys that catch your eyes in this draft?
Yeah, so there are 2 big ones. Again, I fully expect the Jordan Addisons to be gone, the Quentin Johnsons to be gone. And it's not, compared to the past 3 wide receivers classes, it's not as talented as of a crop of receivers. So you really got to be particular. You got to realize, what do we want to get out of this wide receiver, and really narrow the list down to 2 or 3 targets. If you're looking at 43, 42 because of the Dolphins, 42, 43. But a couple that really stick out to me are North Carolina's Josh Downs. Probably I don't think he's the best receiver in the class, but he's my favorite receiver in the class. Really explosive, really nice throttle to be able to get out of breaks without losing any speed buildup. Really slippery after the catch. So I think Josh Downs is that dude. If he's there at 43, like, yeah, you got to take this guy. But again, it's a pretty weak receiver class, so there's a chance somebody could reach and take him round 1. Like, Dallas's wide receiver player is putrid this season. Like, Michael Gallup can't separate outside of CeeDee Lamb and their tight end. Like, out of Schultz and CeeDee Lamb, it's like, there's like they're giving Noah Brown significant snaps. Like, so like there's teams like that at the back end of the first. So he might not sneak out of the top 32. He might not sneak all the way down to 43. So, but the second guy is Cincinnati's Tyler Scott, who I also love. Him and Downs have a very similar play style. Again, Tyler Scott, his bio says he's already been clocked in the 4.2s on the 40-yard dash. Again, those schools love to kind of boost those numbers a little bit, but he's certainly a low 4.3 guy. And he's going to test off the charts in Indianapolis. But similar to Downs, he throttles very well. Like, there's a difference between just blazing speed and knowing how to use that speed to manipulate hips of defensive backs, to create blind spots, to throttle down and get out of routes effectively. And Tyler Scott's unbelievable at that. Unbelievable at that. Like, he's running 15-yard blaze outs without like coming down speed wise. Like, he knows how to throttle down. He knows how to get out of his breaks. Big thing with Anthony Schwartz. Can't do it. When I watch Jalen Hyatt out of Tennessee, same kind of things. Like, this guy just might be a pretty straight line speed guy. I don't see a lot of throttle. I don't see a lot of nuance with his routes. So I'm a little colder on Jalen Hyatt. But Tyler Scott, Josh Downs are the two guys that I would be thrilled if the Browns found a way to bring in.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have this conversation about speed in the NFL for draft prospects, and we only talk about it with the 40-yard metric. And for a metric that, like, for wide receivers, we put the most stock into it out of any position. And I feel like we misuse it the most with wide receivers. Because, like, at least with, like, big guys, we're not like, oh, he ran like a 5, whatever 40 it was, unless they're like Jordan Davis and you run like a 4.83 or something crazy like that. But the thing that's for them is like, hey, we want to see your 10-yard split, see some explosion. You know what I mean? In those first steps, see how much explosion you can create with your lower body. With wide receivers, we look at that 40-yard that 40-yard time, and we're like, that's going to be how fast he is doing everything. And I feel like it would be more useful if we just hooked them up to a speedometer and took mile per hours while they run actual routes. Like, it's like, I feel like that would be a more useful metric, because then they would have to cut. We do everything at the combine to measure how good somebody's going to be at football, except for anything resembling football at times. It's mind-blowing to me that we're still like, okay, let's measure speed like that. And we have the technology to where we can hook these guys up to a chip and then be able to just say, hey, let's see how fast he is while running this route. We don't even have to do that in the combine. We can do it with like tape now, where we have the sophisticated technology to do that. And with Anthony Schwartz, I felt like that came up a lot, because my thing was like, when you watch him at Auburn, you had to be told that he was that fast. You didn't really see very many things where you're like, oh, wow, that guy's fast. Like, who was DeAnthony Thomas? Might have been like the fastest dude I've ever seen in college football, where like you watched him and you're like, that dude's fast. Like, he looks very fast. But some guys look fast, they're not fast. Some guys don't look fast, but they are fast. Some guys aren't fast, but they can separate. Some guys are fast, can't separate. You know, it's this whole mix of things that, like, we try to just throw into 140 time, and it's no wonder we get bad results from that all the time.
And Anthony's issue is that he's stiff, man. Like, he's stiff. Like, even on end arounds, you watch that guy try to turn a corner on an end around, and just like, buddy, you are looping this thing way long instead of putting your foot in the ground and getting upfield. So, and that goes back to being able to throttle down and run routes as well. Like, speed is great, but if you don't know how to effectively utilize that speed, stem effectively in and out, like each step has a purpose, like, then that's great. But like, your route tree is really going to be like 8s and 9s. That's it.
Yep. And when you ain't got to worry about anything else, it's pretty easy to defend that. So, you know, I wonder when we're going to like adjust some of this stuff, because I feel like we're still doing the same combine from pretty much the beginning of this, where it's the same idea. It's the 40 times, it's all this. But like, I feel like this could get a little bit more scientific with it. But then we're going to start saying analytics and scare off half the fan base.